And I think we're live. Let's see. It says it's setting up the webinar, redirecting to YouTube, and we're live. Welcome, everybody, to Dog Shirt Television, a highly experimental, highly improvisational series that we're going to be doing. For those of you who have watched in lieu of fun, this will not be too much of a surprise. For those of you who've never watched in lieu of fun, buckle up, because it's what we do when we're not allowed to have fun anymore. We are once again allowed to have fun, but one of the things that not being able to have fun did was it interrupted a lot of our reading, because we had all this extra time, and so we used it to not read things. And these days, the only things that I am actually allowed to read are briefs filed either by or against Donald Trump. And as much as I find that wonderful, a great way to spend my professional life, it is also a little bit monotonous. And so I decided that I was going to start reading again, read all the things that I've been meaning to read, and to force myself to do it and to force all of you to do it too. I was going to have a show about it in which I invited authors of books I wanted to read on. And I thought, who better to start with than Sean Mirski, who among other things, he has many amazing things in his background, but among other things, I think got his start writing in public, mostly writing for Lawfare as a law student. He is one of the best student contributors we ever had, and he is now the author of this, We May Dominate the World: Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus, which is recently published this spring, right, Sean?
Late June, yeah.
Yeah. So I adore this book because it is counterintuitive in just about every way that a book can be counterintuitive. I learned, I think the technical term is a shit ton from it, about all these aspects of U.S. foreign policy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, of which I was dimly aware, like that we intervened in a whole lot of Latin American countries over and over again, and that, the Marines went to Nicaragua and stuff, and that we occupied Haiti for 19 years. But that I actually didn't really know anything about, and I kind of thought had a weird, awful negative odor of imperialism and Yankee go home and all of that. And I read this book and basically learned that it was the story of the Iraq War over and over and over again, only with a twist, which was that we kind of won, despite, as Bob Dylan would say, losing every battle. And so, Sean, I want to start with how we should understand the overall thesis of this book. Is this the story of how the US basically did the Iraq War over and over and over again for like 85 years? Or is it the story of how we did the Iraq War over and over 85 years and it worked great?
A little bit of both. I think, why not both? The story that I tell in the book starts in at the beginning of the Civil War and goes all the way up to the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. So it's about a century of American foreign policy. And if you want to put it in Trumpian terms, this is the story of how America became great rather than became great again. It really is the story of how we started out as this war-torn republic and ended up in this, kind of global superpower status. And the argument that I make in the book is that this kind of rise to international greatness was a journey that sort of took us through our region, through the Western Hemisphere, and that before we could really have the freedom of action that we needed to be a global superpower abroad, we needed to create a sphere of influence in our immediate region, and then consolidate that in a way that basically made us, practically speaking, invulnerable. And so the story it has a lot to it, but the focus is kind of on this period from 1898 to 1918, when we just went on this rampage across the region. I think by my count, we used force or threatened force an average of nearly 3 times a year against our neighbors. And some of that was relatively minor uses of force. We landed Marines to protect embassies. Other times, Ben, as you mentioned, it's occupying Haiti for 19 years. It's occupying the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Cuba, along with a host of annexations, protectorates, and all sorts of very bloody interventions. And the argument that I make in the book is that a lot of this was essentially about nation building. So the analogy to Iraq, I think, is exactly right. Our goal in doing these interventions, or at least I argue, was to essentially stabilize these states, many of which were at that time basically failed states or failing states. And we wanted to do that because we were afraid that if we didn't do it, some European great power would come in and do it and essentially kind of insert itself into the region in violation of the longstanding Monroe Doctrine, and end up with a permanent place in the Western Hemisphere. And we didn't want that. And so we thought the best way to prevent that was to basically fill those power vacuums with our own power. In one sense, this was the Iraq War over and over and over again, because what ended up happening is we tried to nation build, and we tried to do it with as little violence as possible, as little force, as little coercion. And inevitably, our efforts to nation build were just a disaster, right? And every time we applied a little bit of force, we ended up destabilizing these nations even further, which meant we had to apply more force. And we got sucked into these long kind of occupations that at the end of the day really didn't yield much in terms of stability. When we left Haiti, when we left the Dominican Republic, when we left all these other countries, the record that we left was not, these happy, prosperous, democratic societies. It was societies that tottered along for a few years before collapsing right back into civil war and revolution, or basically being taken over by authoritarian strongmen, neither of which were really kind of the goal that we were going for. And so at that level, it really was Iraq over and over again. On the other hand, the main goal, the kind of overarching objective of all this was to prevent Europe from coming into these power vacuums. And I think you can debate about whether we needed to go as far as we did to kind of accomplish that goal. But there's no dispute that by the time we basically started wrapping up these interventions in the 1920s, we'd basically accomplished the goal. And at that point, we had achieved that sort of regional supremacy that I mentioned earlier.
All right. So we're gonna go back to every component of that, because there is no component of it that isn't fascinating. But I want to start with you, because you are a lawyer at a big firm in Washington. You were a Supreme Court clerk, and you were an appellate court clerk. You've done all the fancy lawyery things. And secretly, when no one was watching, you were a foreign policy historian of U.S. foreign policy in the 19th century. How did that happen, and how does one become a closet historian while practicing law?
The answer is very, very slowly. This book took me 8 years to write. I had to take an entire year off as a sabbatical.
But how did you get into the subject? And I mean, it's not like, when you're sitting there at Arnold and Porter, and you're like, yeah, but in 1865, the French tried to install an emperor in Mexico. Like, yeah. How did you get into this subject?
So, but first off, that's not that far off from the actual truth, which is that oftentimes I am sitting in my office at Arnold and Porter and daydreaming about, European interventions in the hemisphere. No, but the truth is I got sucked into this. I actually blame Jack Goldsmith, your partner in crime at Lawfare, because for a variety of reasons, historians are often fond of pointing out that rising powers tend to be aggressive and expansionist, right? And by that, we basically mean that rising powers tend to pick fights with other great powers, they tend to bully their neighbors, and they try to just dominate greater and greater slices of their regions and the world. And I've always been a China guy. I've been sort of focused on East Asian security issues because for various reasons, I think that is sort of the central geopolitical question of the century. And China, I think, is sort of bearing out the conventional wisdom that rising powers are aggressive and expansionist. But we have a long runway to go. And I've never been very satisfied by the explanations as to why it is that rising powers act that way. And so at some point, I got it into my head that it would be sort of fun at some point to look into the question of, like, why is it that rising powers act this way? And then I think in one of Jack Goldsmith's classes in law school, we read about a case relating to the bombing of Greytown, which was this little seaport on the eastern edge of Nicaragua that I think in like 1954 or something, or sorry, 1854, something like that, the US Navy just came in and literally burnt the whole town down to the ground. And I remember sort of thinking like, wow, I had never heard of this. This is just like a completely random case that just mentions this offhandedly. I wonder, what led to it. And so a combination of factors convinced me that looking at the United States as a case study for why rising powers act this way would be, kind of an interesting way to approach the subject. And the bombing of Greytown doesn't make it into the book because it precedes the Civil War, but it sort of started me out on this journey, and I thought I was just going to write an article. And then I had dinner with Jack, and I was gushing about the Monroe Doctrine, and he said, number one, don't call your book the Monroe Doctrine or anything like that. No one's going to buy it, which was good advice. And then he said, two, by the way, you're writing a book. And I was like, no. And then once he said that, 8 years later, we are where we are.
All right. So you brought up the Monroe Doctrine. I didn't. One of the first things I learned from this book is that over basically, it's more than 100 years, American policymakers are maniacally obsessed with the Monroe Doctrine. Yes. And I had my high school civics history understanding of the Monroe Doctrine was that President Monroe articulated in a series of messages to Congress that European powers weren't allowed to interfere with the, the newly independent, mostly former Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and that we were kind of going to keep them out of the, once imperialism was over in the Western Hemisphere, it was done, and that all the European powers kind of snapped to attention and never interfered in the Western Hemisphere again. And that is why we have peace and prosperity in the Western Hemisphere. Turns out, if I'd thought about it, it had to be a little bit more complicated than that. I am interested, first of all, in your sociological, historical take, why the Monroe Doctrine, which was, after all, just a set of messages to Congress that European powers should keep their hands off the Western Hemisphere, why did this have such a hold on American policymakers that well into the 20th century, it is the reference point for, we have to go invade Cuba for the third time, because if we don't, the Monroe Doctrine might be upset.
Yeah, well, and I can't remember if this ended up in the book, but on the 100th year anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, 1923, there's this like phenomenal ad in the New York Times that I think, I'm forgetting who took it out, I think some religious organization, where it was this prominent quote, and it says, "I believe in God, the Constitution, and the Monroe Doctrine." And that was like, truly, that was the attitude that policymakers took. I mean, it was right up there with the Constitution and God. It was, at the level essentially of what containment became during the Cold War. It was just sort of the central defining part of American foreign policy. But as you said, didn't start out that way. When Monroe delivered his message in 1823, there were a couple articles, newspapers that published saying, hurrah, America. The problem was we had no way of enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. And so for the next 40 or so years, I wouldn't say languished in obscurity, but it sort of began by kind of falling. At first, it was, I think, caught up in partisan headwinds. And eventually, what ended up happening is, if memory serves, in the 1840s and the 1850s, it started up being picked up by the Democrats and some of the internal debates over things like, not that this is a clear reference point, but the possible intervention in the Yucatan during the 1850s. And at the time, it was seen as sort of a smokescreen for the I think, expansionist interests of the kind of the slave South, right? As a way of sort of justifying us getting involved in Mexico and other places in a way that would lead to slave states entering the Union. But I think in part because it was entering the debate, and in part because it was starting to get championed at higher and higher levels, including, for instance, President Buchanan, it got a real hold on at least half the country. And then you have the Civil War, and the Civil War is really where it just sort of crystallizes because, as you mentioned, during the Civil War, France and a few other great powers saw the United States in distress and said, "Aha, this is our moment to essentially, come back into the Western Hemisphere, expand our influence, and start to kind of make up for the lost ground." And so France ends up invading and occupying all of Mexico. It kicks the democratically elected president of Mexico off the throne of Montezuma, puts in a Habsburg emperor as a puppet prince.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that because that's
Yeah.
one of the, like, I
Yeah.
actually knew about that whole escapade, but that's one of the truly deranged little things that wasn't our fault that happened.
Oh yeah, and but the more remarkable thing, and again, parts of this just didn't make it into the book for conciseness reasons, but it's hard to overstate how much Americans reacted to that, to the point that like during the Civil War in like 1864, like the North and the South are still at each other's throats, people are dying on the battlefields. There was very serious conversations had by high-level policymakers in both the North and the South about calling a truce in the Civil War and sending a joint army down into Mexico with both General Lee and General Grant to basically kick the French out of Mexico, because that was obviously a more important priority than finishing the Civil War. And then the idea was like, once the French were out of Mexico, we can then resume the Civil War, come to a negotiated settlement, whatever. But this was like a very serious idea. And the only, I don't want to say the only reason it didn't happen, but one of the main reasons it didn't happen is simply Abraham Lincoln and Seward looked at the war and said, we are going to win this thing and then we'll deal with the French. And that's exactly what happened. But I think it sort of testifies to the point that Americans in both the North and the South at that point just really realized that like what was happening as a result of the Civil War, it was sort of a vision of what the future could hold if the Monroe Doctrine wasn't enforced. And so that was the sort of crisis that really, I think, sort of cemented the Monroe Doctrine in the public imagination. And for the next 100 years, it was just sort of the thing that Americans cared about.
All right. So I want to ask whether that was a reasonable judgment or a crazy one that worked out well. Because the story that you tell is that we do all kinds of deranged things, and the response to, the Habsburg Emperor of Mexico is not really one of them. We'll come back to that, but we do all kinds of crazy things because somebody whispers boo that some European power is going to have an operation in Venezuela or in Haiti or in Cuba, and we tie ourselves in knots occupying these countries, establishing customs unions for these countries, taking over their customs systems, all to avoid a European power getting a foothold. And yet, in the short term, the results of these are almost monotonously the same. That is, we provoke revolutionary activity, we destabilize countries we're trying to stabilize. And yet, in the longer term, by the end of the book, there is, in fact, hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, which, as you begin the book by saying, is an accomplishment that no other power has ever managed. And so I guess my question to you is the maniacal obsession with the Monroe Doctrine a folly that we lucked into a good outcome with, or is it actually it was worth all of these little skirmishes in which we had to kick ass or sometimes get Marines' asses kicked in order to establish over essentially 100 years?
Yeah, so I guess I'll give two answers and maybe introduce a little bit of nuance into the question. I think there's no doubt that the Monroe Doctrine, as declared, was a phenomenally good idea, and it was incredibly important to American security and power to have it. The sort of dream of having a hemisphere where every other great power was eliminated was one that I think was completely understandable just from a security perspective. I mean, international relations scholars have often said for a long time that achieving that kind of supremacy, that sort of regional hegemony, really makes you essentially invulnerable. And I think that's right. I think Americans understood that from way before even, Latin America started gaining its independence. And the fact that we kind of steadfastly aimed at that objective and kept at it for essentially 150 years, I think testifies to some real foresight and sort of, at the very least, some structural factors that made us understand the importance of that goal. And as to whether the Monroe Doctrine was ever really threatened, I think the answer again is yes. And it's hard to play it out because a number of these interventions that we were trying to preempt never really went anywhere. And so, or they really were just figments of kind of American imagination. But one of the ones that, but others weren't. There really were instances where Europe kind of was on the verge of intervening. I mean, the French example in Mexico is a great one, but Kaiser Wilhelm II, in Germany, he never really got the opportunity, but Lord knows he was hungering after the Western Hemisphere, and all his like private notes and all that, he was talking about how someday, the day would come when Germany would descend. And I think what's incredibly important to remember is the sort of counterfactual, which is what happened in the rest of the world during this period. And the answer is it's called the Second Age of Imperialism for a reason. From 1870 to 1900, Germany, Great Britain, and France alone colonized 9 million square miles, which is twice the size of Europe. And by the time you get to World War I, I think the statistic is something like 85% of the world's landmass is under the control of colonial powers, right? I mean, only 15% is still independent. And that 15% is more or less the Western Hemisphere, where not a single nation gets colonized, whereas in the rest of the world, you can literally count on one hand the number of states outside of Europe that managed to maintain independence. And maybe that's a coincidence. Maybe it's a coincidence that the only region that's home to a jealous great power is able to kind of keep that region's independence. But I think the evidence is pretty strong that but for the presence of the United States, Latin America would have been carved up in that colonialist binge just as much as the rest of the world. Now, the nuance here is that all that goes to sort of the overall goals of the Monroe Doctrine and whether it was actually threatened. The hard question is whether the U.S. response to that, and in particular, all the interventions and the way we executed the Monroe Doctrine was necessary. And to some extent, I don't have a great answer because the answer really just depends on trade-offs, right? And probability assessments. And so if you're a US policymaker and you're contemplating an intervention and you know that, let's say there's a 5% chance that if you don't launch that intervention, a European power is going to come in, it's going to start a scramble for Latin America, and by the end of it, the US is going to face existential threats on its borders. Do you launch the intervention, right? It's only a 5% risk, but on the other hand, it's 5% that is borderline existential from a security perspective. How does the answer change if the risk is 30% or 1%? And, these are the calculations American policymakers were making all the time, and they consistently favored intervention where there was really any chance of a threat. And on the one hand, you can say, well, it was obvious that in the vast majority of these cases, nothing would have happened if we hadn't intervened. And I think that's right, but I don't think that actually answers the question, which is, how do you weigh those probabilities? And do you err on the side of intervening where, the costs can be tremendous to the nations that we are intervening in. But from the US perspective, at least, they didn't seem that big at the time we were doing it. And so, the costs were getting borne by someone else and American security was on the line. So ultimately, it doesn't really surprise me that the US acted the way it did.
All right, so let's go back to Mexico, which I think, in addition to being just a bizarre story, casts a huge shadow over this period because it actually involved landing a 40,000 person continental army on American shores and installing a monarchy, and not just any monarchy, but a Habsburg monarchy, which
the
is
best kind of monarchy.
Yeah, well, it is actually the best kind of monarchy, but that's not the way our forefathers in running this country sort of tended to think about it. I love the Habsburgs, but I seem to be one of the few.
In fairness, I think Americans didn't particularly love any monarchy. I'm not sure there was any good monarchies in their view.
But there's something about a 800-year-old one that is, kind of teetering on its last legs and gets installed. The Emperor Maximilian gets installed by, of all people, Napoleon III, who is, of course, the anti-imperial emperor of France, who's seems to have forgotten that they're supposed to be the heirs of the French Revolution and have decided that they're the heirs of the Bourbons. And he wants a stable government in Mexico, nipping at the butt of the United States. So he persuades a third-rate Habsburg in Brazil to become emperor. And
not third rate. This is the brother of Franz Josef. This was the Archduke.
Okay, so second rate.
Second rate.
He couldn't persuade one who actually had a throne.
Yes.
And of course, for those who know Mexican history, this is really when Mexicans think about the liberation, they're thinking about this war more than the original liberation from Spain. This is the war that gives rise to the great leader who has Maximilian executed, whom you treat kind of glancingly, but this is an event that looms really large in Mexican history. From our point of view, it's kind of a comic episode, and yet it's not comic from the point of view of Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant or Andrew Johnson or most importantly Seward, who is Secretary of State at the time, Secretary of War at the time. And I had not realized what a long shadow it casts over the next 85 years of American foreign policy. So why is this such a big deal? And how many Haitians and have died as a result of it? No, I'm joking about the latter point, but what is the consequence of the long tail of it?
Yeah, well, so there's no doubt that at the time it was not seen as a comic episode by kind of Americans, in part because in the throes of the Civil War, there was a real risk, first that the North was going to lose, but second, there was this constant kind of brooding threat that one of the European great powers would intervene in the Civil War. And for anyone who's a kind of Civil War history buff, that risk was a very real one, right? I mean, the Great Britain and France both at various times contemplated it. The French intervention in Mexico ended up sort of being an offshoot of that same threat. And one of the arguments that that Mexican historians make is that but for the sort of Mexican Republican resistance to the French invasion, the North would have lost the Civil War. And the argument goes something like this, which is that the French landed troops in Mexico in late 1861, early 1862, and they marched on the capital and thought they could take it quite easily. And at the time, the French army was the best in the world. There was just no doubt. And France really sent some of their crack troops for this particular expedition. But on May 5th, 1862, they get rebuffed in Puebla. And of course, that ends up becoming Cinco de Mayo in the United States, which is oddly celebrated more in the United States than Mexico, but it dates to this kind of battle where the Mexicans, completely the underdogs from kind of really everyone's perspective, end up totally repelling the French. And as a result, the French expedition's knocked back on its heels, and it takes Napoleon III like a full year to send reinforcements and basically eventually make his way into the Mexican capital. Why do I mention this? Well, the reason is that once the French take the capital, they then start spreading over the rest of the country, and eventually they reach the border with the United States, and they actually carry out quite an active trade with the Confederates in ways that, frankly, really support the Confederates in their war effort. But the Mexican historian argument is that but for the battle on Cinco de Mayo, the French would have reached the border with the United States a year earlier in 1863, as opposed to 1864. And in 1864, it was obvious the Confederates were going to lose, and the French emperor didn't want to throw his support behind them. But in 1863, that was not the case. And there's a very, very good chance, and I think this is actually probably right, that if the French had linked up with the Confederates at the border in 1863, the French would have really sustained the Confederate insurrection war effort in ways that actually might have eventually potentially even led to French intervention, but at minimum would have helped the Confederates last potentially to the point where they won the Civil War. Now, there's counter arguments here, and one of them is that Lincoln and Seward and all the rest of the cabinet completely understood that this was a real threat. And so Lincoln, during the war, was actually diverting troops down to the Rio Grande and launching operations in Louisiana, Texas, and kind of down in the Deep South, even though his generals said that there was no real purpose to it militarily. But he understood the sort of risk of the French linking up with the Confederates. And so for him, this was sort of a no-brainer that you had to sort of prioritize the bigger strategy over the kind of the specific military battles being fought in Virginia and elsewhere. Anyway, that's a real dive into the weeds of kind of this particular intervention. But there was a real like scarring effect, I think, on Americans that they sort of understood how close of a call it had been. And we can look at the intervention in retrospect and say, well, Napoleon III was never really going to get anywhere. For reasons that I think are probably true. I mean, Mexican nationalism was really activated. It would have been very, very hard for the empire to really sustain itself over the long term. And of course, Napoleon III was dealing with Germany rising next door and, eventually ended up losing the Franco-Prussian War and, getting kicked off the throne as a result. So there's all sorts of reasons why you can sort of say in the long run, this intervention wouldn't have panned out. But again, from the perspective of Americans, it really wasn't that obvious at the time. And so it ends up having this kind of, as you said, this hold on 85 years of American foreign policy. And again, something I didn't mention in the book, but I love bringing out because talks like this allow me to. FDR was obsessed with Maximilian in France, Maximilian in Mexico, which was the Habsburg emperor. And in a large part of his private correspondence, he was basically worried about the Nazis doing the exact same thing that the French had done. And so I forget which speech it is. It might be the Arsenal of Democracy speech or the Four Freedoms or one of his big speeches. He actually talks about how the Nazi threat is not a threat of the Nazis invading, the East Coast or anything like that. Instead, he says what they'll do is they'll try and establish a foothold like Maximilian in Mexico. And, as I said in his private correspondence, he said the same thing to reporters, to his cabinet. This was just sort of a defining thing that sort of really kind of shaped his worldview.
I mean, I gotta say, like a lot of the attitudes that politicians express in this book are, quite foreign to me as a reader. Particularly their very deep, sometimes racial, sometimes not, contempt for Latin American culture, and their total lack of understanding of the countries in which they're dealing. This aspect strikes me as completely reasonable. There was a French army on the southern border of the United States. We talk about invasion when we're talking about migration of would-be asylees across that border. There was actually a French army that made it to that border. I would think, it amazes me that that's not more of a, that doesn't have kind of more hold on our memory and imagination today than it does. And I totally get why Roosevelt was, fixated on it, especially because, and I don't want to jump too out of order here, especially because, according to your quoting of them, the Kaiser was actually himself kind of obsessed with this idea, and this idea that, we've carved up Africa, there's nowhere else to go. So Latin America is, Brazil looks nice, kind of.
Oh yeah, I mean, and for Kaiser Wilhelm, I mean, Germany in part was a late comer to the game of empire, to the colonial game. Germany didn't really consolidate its rise until the 1870s, 1880s, and so by the time it starts looking abroad, I mean, it snags a few colonies here and there, but there's this sort of palpable sense among German leaders that they're late and that they need to catch up to the French and the British empires. And you actually have German officers saying, basically the entire world has been carved up other than China and Latin America. And, China, very quickly, Germany establishes a foothold in China. And it's clear that German naval officers are very interested in doing the same thing in Latin America. Part of the problem for Germany, of course, is that as much as it would be nice to set up a colony in Latin America, Germany has much bigger problems at home. And it's constantly worried about the French, constantly worried about the Russians, the British. And, Americans understood this. They weren't stupid. They got the fact that there was a balance of power in Europe and that would constrain kind of German ambitions. But there was always the chance that, the balance of power would shift in a way that gave Germany an opening to kind of go across the ocean and try and do something, much in the same way that Maximilian had, a couple decades earlier, or sorry, as Emperor III had with Maximilian a couple decades earlier. And so it's hard to say because it never panned out. So it really does seem like one of these, kind of pie in the sky dreams that maybe Americans shouldn't have taken seriously. But I think that's just sort of by nature, by virtue of the way that events shook out, but it doesn't change the fact that I think the risk was in some sense very real.
All right, so we have a question from Ev, which actually dovetails nicely with a question I was contemplating anyway. So Ev, go ahead and I may elaborate on it. But you got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I was actually wondering if you consider the success of the Monroe Doctrine to be an accomplishment or more like a necessary evil.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't know that I can give an answer that really is anything other than sort of my personal opinion. But I guess to define terms, I would say the success of the Monroe Doctrine was effectively expelling and kicking out every other great power from the Western Hemisphere. And what that allowed the United States to do was to venture abroad in a way that other powers in history have not been able to. So, we as Americans, I think, sort of take it for granted that we have bases across the rest of the world, and that we can send our military wherever. And it never really, I think, occurs to most Americans that most powers can't do that, right? I mean, China doesn't have the option to take 300,000 troops and send it halfway across the world because it's worried about force levels with Russia or with India or even with Vietnam. And for the United States to sort of have that unfettered ability to go anywhere and do anything without having to worry about any enemy at its gates is freeing and has allowed the United States to do a number of things that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. And so some of the obvious examples are just the way we fought World War II abroad, and for the most part not on not on American soil. But one of the examples I sort of tease at in the book is the Cold War itself. Our strategy during the Cold War was containment. We are containing the Soviet Union largely to Eastern Europe and sort of Northern Asia, and to a lesser extent, sort of, skirmishing with it in Africa and other places in the world. I think the question that's not often asked is why were we containing the Soviet Union as opposed to the Soviet Union containing the United States? And the sort of obvious answer is, well, because we had this sort of hegemony in the region and we could go abroad, station all our troops right at the Soviet Union's borders, or at least right at the Warsaw Pact's borders, in a way that the Russians really couldn't do in reverse. And when they tried it, for instance, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, Americans reacted extremely violently and extremely forcefully in ways that, frankly, from the Russian perspective, was probably hard to understand, right? I mean, we completely blew our lid at the Russians installing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. But of course, from the Russian perspective, we had tons of nuclear missiles in Europe pointed right at Russia, right? And so there's this sort of sense that the US has been able to maintain this double standard in the way it approaches the world and the way it treats other great powers and what it expects of them, in large part because of this hegemony we have at home. And so, on the whole, I would say that American involvement in the Cold War and in World War II and in other places has been good for the world. I mentioned before that I think, but for the Monroe Doctrine, there's a very good chance Latin America would have been colonized, from 1870 to 1914. All of that I think is good, and I think probably outweighs the bad, but it's very hard to sort of normatively weigh these things, because there's no doubt that the consequences of American interventionism, both in Latin America during this period and elsewhere in the world later, including in Iraq and Afghanistan, it had serious consequences. And so, how you weigh all that is, I think, a very kind of individualized judgment.
All right, so I want to go back to the strategic logic of the US position, which is always framed in defensive terms. And you seem to accept that framing, that, we have no ambitions on the territory of any of these countries. We merely want to prevent Great Britain from getting a foothold, or the Kaiser from getting a foothold, or Hitler or Napoleon III. And it's all about, it's not an imperial ambition on our part, notwithstanding the occasional annexation of the Philippines or Puerto Rico. It's really the broad stream is really a kind of defensive mania that causes you to react like an imperialist to any sign of imperialism. And I'm reminded of this by something that you don't mention in the book, which is that Rome, in building an empire, had a very similar ethos, right? That it never started a war, and it would do all kinds of things to get somebody else to throw the first rock, or lie about it and claim that somebody else had thrown the first rock. But it always had a highly legalistic formulation of how its wars were defensive, even when they were clearly not. And so my question is, was this an example of the United States establishing imperial hegemony in a fashion that any of these imperial powers would simply recognize as such, and deluding itself that it was, acting from benevolent and defensive motives? Or is this or is the trick that it was actually totally sincere, and they were kind of backed into imperialism by their own defense and opposition to imperialism, and it's kind of one of the ironies of the era that the Monroe Doctrine was just as sincere as people, as Teddy Roosevelt thought it was?
So it's a great question. I think I'm going to generalize because, again, we're looking at 100 years of history. There were many interventionisms, many interventions. I tried to be candid in the book about which ones I thought were motivated by, more than sort of defensive intentions. And so the Spanish-American War, there's no doubt there was part of the logic I described did apply to the Spanish-American War, but the war itself was not started primarily for sort of benign defensive reasons. And, that's also true of other interventions like the taking of Panama, Teddy Roosevelt's famous, not annexation of Panama, but at least involvement in the revolution that separated Panama from Colombia. So with the caveat that there are exceptions, I do think on the whole, it is this sort of genuine commitment to this kind of defensive ethos that nevertheless, ironically, sort of led to exactly the thing that the United States was trying to prevent against. And I think teasing apart kind of how genuine it was, it's hard to do, but I'll point at a few pieces of evidence that convinced me, at least. One is the fact that these leaders were genuinely opposed to intervention, and that almost all of the violent interventions that the US was launching, the leaders who launched them at the time were just like beside themselves about how upset they were to launch them. And that includes everyone from Woodrow Wilson, who of course is like famously, pro self-determination, to people like Teddy Roosevelt, who were not that way, have this reputation as being kind of the rough riding imperialist. But when it came time to occupy Cuba in 1906, it is hard to overstate how upset he was about that idea. I mean, and it's not, again, I don't trust public speeches of presidents when they say, well, oh, we were forced into this, I mean, that's one thing, and I think that's
But the
appropriately
private
Islamic.
correspondence is a
Yeah, the
different
private
thing.
correspondence, including like to your son or to your, you're writing in your diary. And it's possible that some of this was written, with kind of history in mind. But I think it's just too consistent across too long to really say that it's not genuine. Second, sometimes, and I've been in my head sort of thinking that I might eventually write an article that sort of details all the examples, but it is hard to overstate the number of opportunities for expansion in the region that the United States passed up. There were countless times where a nation like Nicaragua would go to the United States and say, please, 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 we'd like to have a protectorate. Like, please come annex us. Like, please, and the United States over and over again said no to these opportunities for expansion. And these opportunities came by way more often than any of the actual interventions the United States ended up launching. And so if you think that the United States is sort of bent on establishing this kind of hegemony over its neighbors, you would think it would take advantage of these opportunities, particularly when they're kind of freely offered. And yet,
not to mention manufacture some with respect to Canada.
Right. Right, exactly. Well, and the United States kind of did do that, but Canada is its own kind of,
Well, but I mean, it did it in 1812, but it never tried to do it again.
Yeah.
And a pure imperialist power would look next door to the undefended border north before it did anything else, I would think.
Yeah, and not least because of racism, candidly. I mean, part of the American reluctance to go into the region was there was a deep-seated sense of racism among essentially all the American policymakers during this period. And so they really wanted nothing to do with Latin Americans, in part because they thought they were inferior. And so Canada, in some ways, is actually a great example because the United States did not feel that way about Canadians. They were seen as sort of, whites that could be annexed into the Union, no problem, in a way that really distinguished Canada actually from the rest of the hemisphere. And so that I think was also kind of part of the story. The other, I guess, final point I'll mention is that, the argument that I make is that the causal sort of mechanism for America and acting aggressively was its fear of great power competition, its fear of great powers coming into the region. When that fear died at the end of World War I, where it just became abundantly clear that the United States was secure in its hemisphere and had achieved regional hegemony, the United States sort of the wave of interventionism ended as well. You had increasing domestic criticism of interventionism in the United States. You had increasing criticism abroad. And there's no doubt that there were interventions in the 1920s, but you can actually see sort of as they start to decline, as they start to become less and less invasive, and as the US just starts to gradually pull back all of its forces from the region. And so one of the points I make in the book is it's really hard to find examples of powers that consciously deconstruct their sphere of influence and do so over many different administrations and many different presidents. This wasn't like a partisan thing. It ended up being kind of, the highs of interventionism were reached by both Democrats and Republicans, as were the lows. And so I think all those factors, to my mind at least, sort of support the fact that this really was sort of a genuine defensive motivation for the United States, even if it really led to some quite aggressive and quite offensive behavior.
All right. So before we have a bunch of audience questions that I want to go to, but I want to ask about some of the some of these interventions in my, again, sort of high school history experience. I learned about the United Fruit Company and banana republics, and I did not learn about the awesomely named Smedley Butler, who strikes me as a guy who is just begging for a biography if he doesn't already have one. Tell us about Smedley Butler or maybe I should say Major General Smedley Butler, and the dark side of these interventions. How many were there and how ugly they got?
Yeah, so Major General Smedley Darlington Butler is one of those heroes.
I forgot about the Darlington. It makes it so much better.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal name. He was born, I'm trying to remember now. He was slightly underage when the Spanish-American War started. So I guess that would put him as being born in the 1880s. He was a Quaker, so in theory, did not use violence. But he ended up being at the kind of tip of the interventionist spear, starting when he enlisted in the Marines during the Spanish-American War. He ends up fighting there. He ends up fighting in the Philippines during the Philippine-American War. He then goes to China during the Boxer Rebellion, and then he comes back and he's involved in Panama, in Mexico, in Nicaragua, Honduras. Just about every single intervention, he's there, and he's a fascinating character because on the one hand, he's an enormously effective, bold, creative soldier, and over again, the United States is launching these interventions with sometimes only dozens of Marines against hundreds, if not thousands, of sort of, native soldiers who are oftentimes shooting at them. And nevertheless, the United States ends up prevailing in almost all of these encounters. And part of that is it's people like Butler who really just with a sense of boldness that is almost like unimaginable, just sort of bluff their way through every situation. And there's these just like hilarious and fascinating stories as he sort of, finds himself dealing with, with these, with these revolutions and civil wars that he gets involved in. But he ends up being a kind of an iconic character because during the 1930s, he sort of has a change of heart where he basically concludes that everything he had done at the behest of kind of the big businesses, and in particular, the Wall Street banks and the banana companies, United Fruit basically being the big one. And he ends up going from being the kind of the Marines Marine to sort of being a pacifist who joins the kind of America First isolationist side of the debate in the United States as being adamantly against any war because all war is, to quote his famous work, a racket. And it's this kind of incredible turnaround, and it had a lot of credibility because by that point he, had 2 stars on his shoulders, he had 2 medals of honors around his neck, and so he ends up, for many generations since, all the way up to the current day, kind of representing the sort of economically minded explanation for American imperialism. In my view, General Butler, he sort of came into these interventions with this mindset that it was all sort of Americans trying to preserve economic interests. And he ended up only, but he never really had evidence for that, right? I mean, he was the man on the ground and he was the one who was sent into to situations, but he wasn't the one sitting in the White House making the decision to intervene or not. And so he ends up having a lot of credibility just by virtue of his background. But I think ultimately his explanations don't really kind of hold up, given that, he wasn't the one making the decisions and doesn't really know much about them.
All right, Paul, you have the next question. Please unmute yourself.
I look forward to reading your book. I was wondering if FDR's good data policy in any way influenced by it.
Ooh, we are having a lot of trouble hearing you. At least I am. Why don't I read your question as you've articulated it in the question in the Q&A? Was FDR's good neighbor policy toward Latin America influenced by his fascination with Mexico and the Habsburgs? Sorry about that, Paul. We just couldn't hear you.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mentioned earlier that starting in the 1920s, the US starts dismantling its sphere of influence. That effort really culminates with what's called the good neighbor policy under FDR, where FDR basically really just unwinds the tape all the way back to kind of mid 19th century and says the US will no longer intervene or even interfere in the domestic politics of its neighbors, which, given the US record by this point, is really sort of an astonishing statement. But for a while, FDR really sort of lives up to it. I don't think there's a lot to suggest, or at least I can't recall anything, that policy itself had any roots in the French interlude in Mexico. Instead, it was mostly based on the fact that Democrats were trying to capitalize on Republican interventions, and in particular, the Coolidge ends up being involved in this intervention in Nicaragua in 1927, which leads to this insurgency by a guy named Sandino, whose name might be familiar because that's where the later Sandinistas took their name from. Anyway, from the domestic U.S. perspective, this intervention is a disaster, much like all its predecessors. And the Democrats, of course, are very quick to sort of make hay out of it. The fascination with Maximilian, I think, ends up actually affecting FDR more in the second half of his administration, when he starts worrying about the Nazi threat to the region. And it's that point that the sort of French invasion of Mexico starts to really kind of grip his mind. And coincidentally, or not coincidentally, I should say, that's when the good neighbor policy starts to slip, and where, with the new sort of great power threat on the horizon, FDR once again starts to intervene in his neighbors in ways that he had previously promised he wouldn't.
All right. Richard, you have the next question. But you gotta
Okay,
unmute yourself.
I hope I'm not breaking up.
Not at all. You sound great. Good to hear your voice.
Oh, nice to see you. So, Sean, you spoke about examining the U.S. as a case study to shed light on the situation that we may be witnessing today with China. And so I'm just curious about about some specifics, like what sort of present day Chinese interests do you think parallel those of the U.S. in the period that you examined, and how much is driven by national security concerns, how much by uncertainty, for example, of what's going to happen in the U.S. political system in the next decade or so, how much it just has to do with things like control of natural resources, and why didn't this begin to happen during the regime of Mao Zedong, for example?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I'll start, I guess, by saying that I think it's fairly clear that the Chinese are attempting to do the same thing in East Asia that we did in the Western Hemisphere, which is to say, to secure regional hegemony by essentially expelling or neutralizing all the other great powers. From the Chinese perspective, that is primarily an objective that's focused on the United States. I think the ultimate dream of any Chinese security analyst is essentially to expel the United States from East Asia, at least as a military presence. And once you sort of see Chinese foreign policy from that perspective, I think there ends up being kind of these remarkable parallels with the United States and its history. And so just to start, we had the Monroe Doctrine. President Xi Jinping in, I believe, 2014, in a speech, basically, and I'm forgetting the exact language, but said something to the effect of, the problems of Asia should be solved by the people of Asia. And it was this whole speech just about how, like, Asia is essentially for Asians, which is, of course, a sort of practically rhymes with the America for the Americans, which was the sort of unofficial slogan for the Monroe Doctrine. And, from the Chinese perspective, I think there's other kind of parallels as well. The United States was obsessed with the great power threat. It was obsessed with the threat of kind of the expansion of European influence in a way that would lead it to become encircled. The Chinese, I think, feel the exact same way about American expansion and influence. If you read Chinese military writings, the way they talk about the United States is that it's trying to essentially contain China to put together this coalition, and it's doing that by expanding its influence in its neighbors. And so there are real, I think, kind of structural parallels there. And of course, it's not surprising that this leads to sort of similar policies. The Chinese have not yet intervened militarily in the same way that the United States did, but they're practicing a large number of the same other policies, ranging from kind of diplomacy that's centered around their economic, the use of their currency, and sort of trying to use loans, for example, to exert political influence. There's other parallels to the way that they're expanding their navy, their bases. But it's sort of a similar kind of playbook that they're adopting from the United States. And I think that's not a coincidence, frankly, although at the same time, and to your question, there's so many factors, of course, that distinguish the two cases, right? I mean, without even talking about like factors unique to China, there's the fact that, we have nuclear weapons now. The trade ties between the two powers are obviously much stronger than the United States' trade ties with Europe. And so there are reasons to think that the situations might be different. I don't deny that in the book, but I think there's sort of what I hope the book does is it gives people who give China the benefit of the doubt, I hope it helps them understand that even nations with genuinely held sort of pacific values and interests can nevertheless end up in situations where they feel compelled to use force to protect their interests. And that might not be like an especially profound point for many people, but it sort of does mean that there's no, I don't think a solution to the rise of China is to hope that China ends up having a peaceful rise in the way that they always promise. Even if they genuinely mean that, I just don't think that that's frankly enough. Finally, you asked about Mao. I think the answer is a little bit complicated, but by that point, I think the Chinese had not really consolidated kind of internal control to the point where they were really confident in kind of projecting power externally. And frankly, I'm not sure they even had the sort of material base of power to do that. I think it really only took the 3 decades of kind of Deng Xiaoping's reforms and the sort of economic rise of China where they got to a position where they could credibly think to themselves, all right, this is our moment. We can sort of attain this.
Yeah, so I want to focus a little bit on some of the differences. You close with a discussion of China in the conclusion of the book, and I look at it and I say I can totally see why a kind of late 19th century US type of thinking explains a lot of what they are doing, but I have trouble seeing them successful in this regard for the following reasons. We were surrounded by dysfunctional states that we were trying to shore up by way of keeping European powers out. They are surrounded by highly functional states like Japan, incredibly militarily economically successful states that produce incredibly, high per capita output. Even the less functional states are, there aren't a lot of Hades in that neighborhood. You're talking about South Korea, you're talking about Japan, you're talking about Vietnam, which they have is increasingly emerging as a manufacturing competitor to them. And these highly, highly functional states actually want other powers, including other military powers, specifically the United States in the region. And that strikes me as a, sort of even on the terms, if Haiti had been Japan and it had wanted the Royal Navy in as a counterbalance to us, the 19th century would have looked pretty different, I think. And so my question is, to the extent that they're thinking about it in the language of the Monroe Doctrine or some Asian equivalent of it, are they kidding themselves?
Yeah,
I
think it's
or are we, sitting here fat and happy like Napoleon III, thinking, oh, those goofballs will never amount to anything.
Yeah, I think I tend to be on the more optimistic side, at least sort of from the American perspective. I do think there's major structural differences in the situations that China faces now and the United States faced then. And one of the biggest is just the neighborhood, right? As you mentioned, I mean, the thing that really defined the United States' rise is that in its entire neighborhood, there was no other great power that was sort of based there, right? I mean, the European great powers had colonies in the Western Hemisphere, but so from the US perspective, all it had to do was sort of eliminate those colonies and that influence one by one. But it never really had to fight any of its neighbors to get to that same level of control. Whereas China finds itself in a situation where it either, if it wants regional hegemony, it has to either outgrow its neighbors so much that it becomes so preponderant that they're just no longer great powers vis-a-vis it, or it has to fight them and essentially, beat them in a war. And both of those, at least in the short term, seem very unrealistic. And so one of the biggest assets I think the United States does have in its competition with China is its neighbors. And And so I do think from that perspective, it is highly unlikely that the Chinese will attain regional hegemony at any point, let's say in the next couple of decades. That said, I do think that the Chinese can still sort of pursue the more modest goal of sort of eliminating the American security umbrella. And I think the objective, the hope on the part of the Chinese, I suspect, is that once the American security umbrella is gone, or even once American credibility to its allies is gone, that you're going to see a lot more behavior in the region of nearby powers saying, you know what, we're not going to fight China. We're going to sort of side with it rather than continuing to oppose it. And so I think that's the hope. I tend to be optimistic in the way, for all the reasons you mentioned, that China is going to have a real problem with that. But I suspect that that's the way that they're primarily thinking about this at this point. If I can add one small thing, you mentioned Haiti calling in the Royal Navy. So it never quite happened like that. But one of the kind of, I think, fascinating what ifs in history is what would have happened if Europe had not descended into World War I. And the reason I say that is because by that point, the kind of wave of American interventionism in Latin America had really kind of reached its peak. And many Latin Americans, for all the obvious and understandable reasons, were quite fed up with being invaded. And they had started to look abroad to Europe for help, for protection against the United States. And so in the category of another thing that people may recall from US history class in high school, there's the Zimmermann telegram, which is this telegram that the foreign secretary of Germany sent to the Mexican president, I believe, basically offering a military alliance against the United States in exchange for, I guess, material support and the Mexican opportunity to reconquer parts of the Southwest. And again, it sounds kind of comic from 100 years later.
It actually sounds like, like something out of a James Bond movie.
And it was. I mean, actually, the story of how the British intercepted the telegram and decoded it in kind of one of the great feats of spycraft.
And then the Germans confirmed its authenticity, which seems
was
like all they really needed to do. No one would have believed it if they'd just said it's not real.
Yes, no, exactly. And in part, the Germans just didn't know how the British had gotten it or how we had gotten it. And so they were worried that by denying it, they would then end up being basically called out. But the truth is the British didn't tell us this at the time, but they had tapped our cables. And so they were actually spying on us. And the Germans actually used American cables to send this message to Mexico because all the German cables had been cut by the Royal Navy. And so they coded this message, and the US, Wilson, out of all his kind of generosity, had offered Germany to use American cables when it wanted to send stuff to Latin America. And so the Germans were like, sure, we will use your generosity to send this message of like essentially war to Mexico. Anyway, and the US probably would have entered World War I regardless, but the Zimmermann telegram certainly pushed Wilson to accelerate the date that we entered World War I. I mean, it really was. In his speech to Congress explaining why we were going to war, very short speech, but the Zimmermann telegram makes an appearance. It was just that important in his calculations. And for anyone who knows the history of World War I, I mean, the date we entered was critical. If we had entered, a couple months later, the war might have turned out very differently. So,
Matteo, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks. This has been a really, really interesting talk. I was wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit more towards about the time exactly when and the process by which the Monroe Doctrine stopped being regarded in the sort of reverential way you talked about earlier, where it was the Constitution, God, and the Monroe Doctrine. Though it certainly seems to be the case that the influence of the doctrine outlived it being spoken of in that way. I think it would be interested to hear your thoughts on when and why it stopped being regarded that way so explicitly.
Yeah, so I'll focus on two factors, but first I'm going to fight the premise of the question by pointing out that Ron DeSantis, the night he declared his candidacy for the presidency, he went on Fox News, and in that interview, he said, we need a new Monroe Doctrine. And anyone who's read Vivek's foreign policy platform, such as it is, knows that he has basically centered it around the Monroe Doctrine. So people like to say that the Monroe Doctrine is dead. I think Secretary Kerry in 2014 said that explicitly, but I think rumors of its death have been greatly exaggerated. It's one of those doctrines that is always, I think, going to have a purchase on the American mind, because it sort of represents the isolationist leanings of the United States. This idea of like, why do we care what happens in Asia or Europe or Africa? This just simply isn't our problem. And I think that's always going to be in some ways an attractive foreign policy platform. And so from that perspective, I think there's still some vitality in it. But to answer your question, so I think two things ended up happening. One was that the Monroe Doctrine had fallen into real disrepute among our neighbors by, as I mentioned, the 1910s, but it really started to register with Americans by the 1920s and the 1930s. And so FDR's good neighbor policy was a way of basically moving past the Monroe Doctrine. And once we got into the Cold War, it just sort of, I think, became obvious to a lot of American policymakers that using the phrase the Monroe Doctrine was not a good way to win credit among Latin American allies or enemies in the region. And so it just sort of rhetorically started falling out of the kind of vocabulary of American statesmen. But the other factor was that the Cold War itself, I mean, just sort of fundamentally changed American foreign policy. I think up until the start of the Cold War, the United States had always really just cared about the Western Hemisphere first and foremost. But starting in about 1950, Europe ends up becoming the most important region in the world to American security, because if the Soviets can kind of control the Eurasian continent, then they can become a regional hegemon of their own, and that will create real problems for the United States. And so you start having this kind of global battle over, over communism and freedom and democracy that, the Cold War we all know and love, the Twilight Struggle. And in that context, that sort of Eurocentric kind of vision of the world, I think the Monroe Doctrine started to seem a little bit obsolete and a little bit antiquated. And I think in part it was buried quite purposefully by internationalist statesmen who wanted Americans to sort of shake off their tendency to only care about the hemisphere and to sort of commit to NATO and commit to the sort of American presence in Europe and the broader goals of kind of global containment. But one thing I note in the book is that there's this moment, I think in, 1970, 1980, somewhere in that decade, where there's a young senator from Delaware named Joe Biden, and he's questioning Henry Kissinger on some activities that the United States is doing in Africa. And Kissinger basically describes containment in a way that leads Senator Biden to say, you're describing a global Monroe Doctrine. And the point I make in the book is that I think that's exactly right. I mean, containment, stepping back, the Monroe Doctrine is oftentimes put in terms of being a prohibition on Europe doing things in the Western Hemisphere. But the kind of flip side of the coin is you can also look at the Monroe Doctrine as basically containing Europe in the old world, right? I mean, it's all the same thing. And so the point I make in the book is that containment itself, yes, it was a way of containing the Soviet Union kind of in the states it already had purchased, but it also was a way of essentially saying, we are moving the Monroe Doctrine from the Atlantic Ocean right up to the borders of the Warsaw Pact. And so I think a large part of kind of American foreign policy during the Cold War ends up really echoing some of the things we were doing, in the run up to it.
Yeah, so I want to end with sort of the question with which we began, and we were talking a little bit about this before we started, so I'm going to frame this in as provocative a way as I can. I can read your book in one of two ways. One is an endless parade of goofball interventions that would be funny if they didn't have such nasty consequences for the local peoples in question. We helped immiserate not a large number of countries, but not a small number of countries, sometimes over and over and over again. We deluded ourselves that we were creating stability when we were generating the instability that we then had to go in and respond to again. We did it with maybe for all the best reasons, but that was, of very cold comfort to the people whose development nationally we stunted as a result, and in some cases particularly Haiti, we definitely contributed to a 200-year tradition of, great powers helping Haitians keep that country as poor and as unstable as humanly possible. And so you look at this and you say, you've basically cataloged a history of folly that we've kind of grown out of, but then, as you describe, kind of grown out of by exporting to the rest of the world. And we used to do it in Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua, and now we do it in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, and elsewhere. And the total number of successes is very small, and the total number of disasters is not very small. And so, you can dress it up as grand strategy, but what it really is reckless goofiness that doesn't learn from its own mistakes. It just repackages them over decades and generations. The other way I can tell the same story is, there is a strategic goal from the beginning, and it is to keep European powers out of the United States, out of the region and away from the United States. This goal was accomplished in a systematic, bipartisan fashion over a long period of time that has allowed the United States to project force all over the place. It has allowed most of the countries in question, including, particularly Mexico, to prosper. Mexico has a higher per capita GDP than Russia these days. Some countries in the region have done extremely well. Some have not. There have certainly been eggs broken to create the omelet, but the omelet has served a lot of people all over the world, and not just in the United States. And so so that we shouldn't be too worried about the Iraqs and the Afghanistans, because, I'm going to state this really provocatively, because, US intervention fails 100% of the time and yet succeeds in the broad sweep of things. And so I'm curious, and your book is so narratively driven, and you actually don't answer the question of which story you're telling, which is one of the things I love. And so I want to add, what percentage of this, as you walk away from this project, is the story of folly and malicious folly, or at least reckless folly? And what percentage of it is the story of, 100+ years of getting to something that no other country in the history of the world has ever accomplished for the benefit of a very large number of people?
Yeah, I mean, so you said the question was sort of returning to where we started, so I'll give the answer that I gave when we started, which is, why not both? I do think that both kind of interpretations are in some sense correct. And one of the things that I try to do in the book, and part of the reason I like history and part of the reason I like foreign policy, is that in today's sort of hyper-polarized age, it's easier in those subject areas to tell what I hope is a more subtle and nuanced story. And so when it comes to this topic, I mean, first, I think you put it really well in terms of the sort of consequences our interventionism had for our neighbors. This book is not primarily sort of a balance sheet of the pluses and minuses of American intervention from the perspective of Latin Americans, but but I think it'd be hard to do any honest accounting that does not sort of end up with us very much in the red in terms of kind of what we did for the region, at least in the countries we were intervening in. And so, and part of that was, I think, perhaps an unavoidable result of the way we structured our foreign policy and the goals we had and the means we chose to pursue them. In other ways, it was, I think, folly, I think, is a good word. Recklessness is a good word, where, we were trying to nation build in nations we knew nothing about. It was sort of from start to finish, there were just mistakes made in kind of catastrophic ways. And so none of that is, I don't think there's any denying that. And to the point you made, whatever our motivations for those interventions may have been, it doesn't change the fact that they were felt the same way by the people who experienced them. Teddy Roosevelt, after he left office, he goes on this famous journey in South America, the river out, where he's exploring this river. And at some point, they indirectly encounter local Indians in the Amazonian jungle, and I think they shoot poison darts at their dog and kill him. And they were talking about how, and Teddy later was giving a speech in front of an audience, and he said, we were very worried that they, would shoot us. And in retrospect, they were probably just scared of us, that we were sort of intruding into their land and sort of tramping about, and, they didn't know who we were. But it turns out that getting shot because someone's scared of you is very similar to getting shot because someone's, affirmatively hunting for you. And so that quote always sort of stuck with me, because I think it kind of well describes the way that the US approached the region. My book is very much not meant to be sort of an exoneration of what the United States did, because, as I said, there's no sort of denying the actual facts of what we did, whatever the motivation might have been. At the same time, I do think that our foreign policy was kind of consistently driven by an overarching goal. And so even if at any level, at any moment, there were particular, mistakes made or kind of individual personality quirks or things that entered into the picture, there's a very clear through line that I think, as I mentioned earlier, both was a completely logical and in many ways a completely, I don't want to say correct, but it was completely understandable, at least from the United States perspective, what it was doing and why it was pursuing it. And I think it was sort of well done from that perspective. I'm not sure I would go so far as to say that that's true of American foreign policy to this day. I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan, whatever else one might say in defense of them, they seem like more wars of choice and less sort of driven by the overarching security concerns that were driving the United States in the period I study in the book. So, it sort of, I guess I'm not sure I would extend my sort of assessment of the US record in Latin America before 1950 to sort of all of the interventions afterwards. But yeah, I think that's probably an unsatisfying answer, because it does sort of refuse to kind of pick a side. But I think that's the truth. I mean, in international politics, as I sort of write in the conclusion, it's very easy to try and tell stories about good and evil. I think people, we're tribal. We like having good and evil. We like having stories where there's a bad guy and a good guy. I think in international politics in particular, that rarely happens. I mean, sometimes it does. World War II is like it's always nice to say, you had the Nazis on the other side, and that's like pretty straightforward. But in most cases, I think statesmen have to choose among options that have real trade-offs, and no matter what you choose, there are going to be bad consequences. It's only a question of how do you minimize the trade-offs and how do you choose kind of the least bad option. And so I think in a lot of ways, my book is sort of a story, hopefully an engaging one, and hopefully, one that tells an important story, but ultimately a story of, how the US tried to choose the least bad option as it was rising to power.
Julia, you get the last question tonight.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I've long thought, first of all, I live in San Diego. I've been here for 50 years. So, the border issues are a thing here. But I've long thought that we have not done enough economically for the other countries in our hemisphere. Some of it, as you note, is racially based historically, but I can't think of one Latin American country that's an economic power in any way. Do you think that that's an opportunity that the US has missed, that maybe we haven't provided enough economic aid in the right way to help them build a solid economy? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something to that. What I guess I would say is that the U.S. foreign aid as a practice only really began in the 1940s. Before that, the idea of the U.S. giving money to foreign nations was, I mean, just literally would have been laughed out of the room. Woodrow Wilson, Secretary of State, actually proposed a variation of the idea in the 1910s, and Wilson was like, "Are you kidding me? Like, we're not doing that. The American people would never stand for it." And it's only really in the 1940s, for reasons I touch on in my book, that the United States starts doing this, and it starts doing it in Latin America, actually, for the first time. And it does so expressly as part of its great power competition with Nazi Germany. The foreign aid is seen as a way of stabilizing countries in the Western Hemisphere to prevent them from being infiltrated by German agents, essentially. And, and that practice, of course, ends up kind of scaling up during the Cold War. And so I think the United States, broadly speaking, its foreign policy, it has wanted to stabilize and strengthen its Latin American neighbors, which means I think the kind of trope of the United States economically exploiting Latin America is at minimum sort of too simple of a story, because from the US government perspective, there was always an attempt to sort of actually help Latin America develop and sort of prosper, because that was part of our strategic interest. In practice, it didn't work out that way. For lots of reasons. One was that American corporations didn't necessarily have that same interest. Oftentimes, they were quite happy to exploit Latin America. And so the US kind of did its best to stop that from happening, but oftentimes unsuccessfully. And so there's a long and complicated kind of record there. But part of it, too, is that, to this day, I think it'd be fair to say that the US struggles with development aid and kind of channeling it in ways that lead to the productive growth of industries and kind of long-term prosperity and economic stability. That was certainly true in the 1940s and during the Cold War, when the US made these efforts in a real way, but they didn't always just pan out because the US didn't necessarily know what it was doing. And then, of course, the final factor is one of the kind of ironic, I think, consequences of US interventionism is that in Latin America since the 1920s, but especially since, the Cold War, there's been a real strain of sort of anti-Americanism that's sort of, I think, inherent in some of the politics of local nations, particularly on kind of the left side of the political spectrum. And I'm speculating a little bit here, but I would guess that at least part of Latin Americans' economic, let me say this. One explanation someone could give, and I am not qualified enough to give it, so with that caveat, one explanation could be that in part Latin America chose during the Cold War to pursue an economic strategy that was not as capitalist as perhaps the United States would have maybe recommended. And one could argue that if, in fact, that economic strategy was less effective at economic growth, that it was in an odd way kind of the result of US interventionism, in the sense that a lot of these Latin American states ended up opposing what would have been a more effective economic strategy, in large part because it was championed by the United States. But again, that gets into all sorts of debates about, kind of the merits of different economic systems and all that. And I'm certainly not qualified to speak to that. But at least that would be, I think, one thing that would be sort of interesting to look into as well.
We are going to leave it there. Sean Mirski, thank you so much for joining us. The book is We May Dominate the World: Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus. I learned a huge amount, and I recommend it extremely highly. We will be back next week, not on Monday, because that'll still be Yom Kippur, but on Tuesday with Will Salatan, the author of that very rare thing, a book that is available for free. It is published by The Bulwark. I think it started life as what he imagined to be an article for The Bulwark, and it just grew and grew and grew into a book. It is called The Corruption of Lindsey Graham, and it is a case study in the effects of Trumpism in a previously sane politician and a previously lucid politician. That'll be, I believe, Tuesday at 8 o'clock. We will normally be Mondays at 8 o'clock. I think still might fidget a little bit with the times. If you have enjoyed this, Share the YouTube stream with others, spread the word. Dogshirt TV is going to make a run at, it's going to be, you know, first at OAN and then at Newsmax, and then we're going to go for Fox, and then we're going to, or maybe CNN first, and then take down Fox. One by one, we're going to replace all of these, and then MSNBC, we're going to take all of these down with highly substantive 90-minute serious commercial-free content about books and other things that people actually should be spending more time with. We will have no punditry. We will have nobody talking about issues they don't know anything about. It's gonna be a wild experiment in commercial-free substance. And that does it for us. Thank you for joining us, and thank